So when we think of restoration, we usually think of adding plants and animals back in, but they can be a lot more complicated if we have to deal with site contamination. And so this is often something that needs to be addressed before you start adding animals and sometimes plants back in. So you can excavate or dredge out contaminated soils, depending on what type of contamination we're talking about here. Sometimes aeration can volatilize certain chemicals, especially things like organic chemicals. If they're heavy metals, that's a lot harder, and so sometimes it needs to be physically removed. You can also sometimes physically remove water by pumping it out and running it through a water treatment plant to remove contaminants. And sometimes you can add other chemicals that may react with the contaminants to make them more benign or make them not be bioavailable, meaning that they couldn't cause toxic effects to organisms. One term that's important here is called bioremediation, and this is when basically organisms break down contaminants. Usually these are fungi, bacteria, and or plants, and usually we're talking about these organic compounds that we want broken down. They found that some of these things can break down oil and DDT and a variety of things. Whether it's effective enough to decontaminate a whole site, that's may need to be researched, especially if it only works under certain environmental conditions. We've also found that plants can be used to remove heavy metals. There are certain plants that are really good at taking up heavy metals, and so you could potentially plant those plants and then harvest them to remove the heavy metals from the site. And that way you don't have to disturb the soil as much. So you can do bioremediation in situ, similar we were talking about conservation that's in situ and ex situ. You can do bioremediation in situ, so at the site. And the example is that certain organic compounds like benzene and toluene can be broken down in the soils with certain microorganisms. It is important to note that complete degradation is often very difficult to achieve. So you can reduce the level of these contaminants, but it's very difficult to remove all of it. Ex situ is when bioremediation is done away from the site, and these techniques involve actually physically removing whatever's contaminated, whether that's water or soil, and then some treatment process is done on those. And you can use something called a bioreactor to process the material in a highly controlled place. Oil spills are difficult to deal with. A lot of us learned about that more with the oil spill in the Gulf that was really destructive, and some restoration needed to be done, and we had to deal with how to get rid of the oil. So there are some different methods for dealing with oil spills at sea. You can use chemical dispersion, which is where chemicals that are designed to remove oil, they're sprayed over an oil spill. You can see this schematic of an airplane spraying this chemical on the oil spill. And the idea is that it breaks the oil into smaller droplets. It can be burned, often called in situ burning. This is basically setting the oil on fire while it's still floating on the water surface. And you can use booms to contain this so it doesn't get moved around a lot by currents. Skimming is when floating skimmers are used to remove thin layers of oil from the surface. Again, booms are often used to contain this to aid in skimming. So this shows kind of real life pictures of some of these things. This is burning off oil. This is a surface dispersant, so they've sprayed something on the oil to kind of break it up into smaller clumps so it's not one giant slick. This is an underwater dispersant, again trying to break the oil up into smaller amounts. Oil spills on shore are also very difficult to deal with, and so this shows some different methods for dealing with that. So you can kind of flush or try to wash certain areas to kind of rinse the areas to help collect the oil. Again, booms can be used to kind of contain the oil in a particular area to aid in cleanup because it gets spread across even larger areas. It may be harder to clean up. Sometimes people use vacuums to suck oil off the surface of things. They often use sorbents, which are these absorbent materials that soak up the oil, and then you can take it away to an offsite for disposal. And these are things that would soak up oil but not soak up water, so they're pretty effective at, once you remove that, it takes the oil with it. There's shoreline cleaners and biodegradation agents. These are things like soap that can help remove the oil. Again, burning may be necessary. Sometimes you can manually remove things, which you can see here. Here they've got shovels and rakes and things, and they're trying to get the oil-covered sand, and they're going to move it somewhere else that's not a sensitive ecosystem. And then there's mechanical removal, where again, they're basically scooping up contaminated sediments so they can be taken somewhere else. There are oil-eating microbes, and there are these bacteria that can break down the hydrocarbons in oil. And this shows a schematic where they eat away at the oil, and they also break it down into smaller droplets. So you can see here, oil sticks to itself, especially when it's on water, because it's hydrophobic. So obviously oil and water don't mix. So the bacteria will eat away at the oil from the outside and break it into these little droplets. And there are some different methods that can be used to speed this up. However, it's very unlikely that all of the oil is going to be eaten up by these microbes. So getting away from oil, we've been talking about bioremediation. When bioremediation is done with plants, it's called phytoremediation. And plants can break down some compounds, and as I said before, they can extract some others like heavy metals. So I don't expect you to know all of these specific phytoremediation terms, but I do expect you to have a basic idea of what phytoremediation is. So these circles are representing this contaminant or pollutant, and in the soil, it might phytostabilize the chemical, which means turn it into something else that's not going to be as toxic. It might break it down. It can also extract the contaminant, so things like heavy metals. Certain species of plants will take up those heavy metals and they can store them in their leaves. That's called phytoextraction. But you probably want to remove those plants once they're done growing so that the contaminant is actually removed if it's something like a heavy metal. Because if you leave the plant there to decompose, that will be re-released into the environment once the plant breaks down. Phytovolatilization is when the plant takes up a contaminant and then releases it into the air, and then it gets diluted as it mixes in with the air. Actual phytodegradation is when the plant takes up the compound and actually breaks it down into something else. So this shows some examples of phytoremediation. So sunflowers can help with radioactive contaminants. Pumpkins were used to help clean up a marker factory spill in New Jersey. Mustard greens can help pull up heavy metals, and I actually had a friend that studied this at a contaminated mine site in Colorado, and she was planting mustard plants and then harvesting them to see how well they could be used to help remediate the soil. This shows alpine pennycrest, which has also been used to help clean up mines in the UK. So beyond contaminants, there may be other problems with the site that we have to deal with. And one of the big things is invasive species. So before we want to start adding our native species in, we might want to try to get rid of as many invasive species as possible. This can be very difficult. Sometimes you can do physical removal where it's exactly what it sounds like. You're literally picking it up and taking it off of the site. You can, sometimes burning will help get rid of invasive species if they happen to not be fire tolerant, but the native species are fire tolerant. Herbicides and pesticides are frequently used in invasive species management. And then there's also biocontrol, which is where you bring in other organisms to help deal with the invasive species. You have to be super careful with this because some invasive species have been created by introducing species to try and control invasive species, and then you have more invasive species, so it doesn't actually help. Sometimes it is effective though, so important thing to think about. So it depends on what kind of biocontrol you're talking about. Sometimes it can be really effective. So like in some places, they've just brought goats in. They're not like permanently introducing a species into the area. They have managed goats that they let go to town eating the invasive plants. And then when they've done a good job, they take the goats and move them somewhere else. That can be pretty effective, but not always. And again, if you're using something that's being introduced potentially permanently to like breed and be established in an area, that can lead to other problems like new invasive species. So this shows an example. Tamarisk, which is also called salt cedar, was introduced from Eurasia in the 1800s, and it forms these giant thickets all along streams in the southwest United States. So this is a picture of it in around the Colorado River near Utah. And they wanted to get rid of this, so they introduced tamarisk leaf beetle, which is this guy, and it's good at defoliating the tamarisk, so that means it just eats all the leaves off. And that allows native plants to recover. So this is an example of where biocontrol actually works.